So now that we understand that the Prophet himself observed a minimum of 2 salah sessions a day, the dawn and the evening, some of us might be wondering about the middle salah that is mentioned in verse 238. We'll also take the next verse, verse 239, in conjunction with that. The common translation for this particular passage reads, "Maintain the contact prayers and the middle contact prayer and stand for God dutifully. But if you are fearful, then you may do so while walking or riding. If you become secure, then remember God has yes taught you what you did not know." The common interpretation for this passage is that God is telling us to maintain the ritual prayers and especially the middle ritual prayer. And there's a lot of debate about this middle ritual prayer. Some have said it refers to the noon, others have said it's the afternoon, others have said it's the night, others have said it's the dawn. But we'll get to that. Then the verse says, "And stand for God dutifully." And they'll tell you that the word stand means to physically stand up. Then in the next verse says, "But if you are fearful," that is, if you are fearful of being unable to observe the standard ritual salah, then you can observe this ritual salah while walking or riding until you become secure. This again is the common interpretation of this particular passage. However, I'd like to share with you a couple of problems here. The verse says, "Guard the salawat and the salatul wusta and stand for God dutifully." What is interesting here is that in the first occurrence of the word salah is in the plural form, whereas in the second occurrence is in the singular form. Now, linguistically speaking, if God is referring to the same genre of salah, that is the ritual salah as they interpret it, then linguistically speaking, the verse should have said, "Guard the salah and the middle salah. Hafidhu ala salah was salatul wusta." In other words, this first occurrence should have still been in the singular tense. Okay? But it's not. It's in the plural form, salawat. Okay? So again, if God is referring to the same genre of salah, which they interpret as the ritual salah, then God would have said, "Guard the salah and the middle salah," and this would have made far more sense. Another thing I want to point out is in the phrase as-salatul wusta. This phrase refers to a positional salah, not a temporal salah. When it comes to the salah session specifically, God is very specific. He will give us a time frame, and He even gives us the names of these time frames. He says Salatul Fajr, the dawn salah, Salatul Isha, the evening salah. But here He says Salatul Wusta, which is positional, not temporal. If God was referring to a salah session here, He could have easily just told us the noon salah, or the night salah, or the afternoon salah, but He does not. In other words, Salatul Wusta is positional, not temporal, has nothing to do with a ritual salah. So let me share with you what I understand of this verse. First, we need to understand again what the word salah means in the first place. And I mentioned that the word salah means to adhere to something. And in the Quranic context, the adherence is to the adherence of God's laws. And what's interesting is that this verse, verse 238 of Surah 2, falls in the midst of verses that talk about relationships. When we read the context, God talks about alcohol, marriage, sex, divorce, promises, weaning, remarriage, and so forth, relationships. And this verse falls in the midst of these verses that talk about relationships. God in this verse says, "Guard the salawat," that is, the different types of adherences to God's laws that are mentioned within the context. This is why He is using the plural form, because there are different laws that are laid out throughout this passage. And so God wants us to guard the different types of adherences to His laws, the relationship laws that are mentioned. And this is also why the next phrase, was salat al-wusta. Note it says al-salatul wusta, the salatul wusta, and not salatul wusta. The difference is that as-salatul wusta refers to a specific form of salah. And wasata means middle, but not necessarily middle in the sense of between numbers. Like if we read Surah 68 verse 28, God calls the most middle person, okay? He says that this person is the most middle, awsatahum. This person isn't being in a position between people, but rather he's most middle in the sense of he's being balanced or non-extreme. So God is telling us to guard the different types of adherences to his laws, the relationship laws, and to guard being middle, being non-extreme, balanced in our adherence to these laws. Then in the last phrase, وَقُومُوا لِلَّهِ قَانِتِينَ, stand for God dutifully, we see a similar phrase in Surah 4 verse 127, where God says, stand for the orphans with justice. The standing here is obviously not a physical standing, but rather it's to uphold the laws that are laid out. So God wants us to uphold these laws dutifully. So this is what this verse is talking about. It's not talking about some ritual salah, but rather it is telling us to ensure that we are adhering to the different laws that are laid out, to be balanced within them, and to make sure that we are standing for them no matter what. Now we come to verse 239. Of course, we need to keep in mind what was already mentioned in verse 238. This verse reads, but if you are fearful, then rijalan or rukbanan, when you become secure, then remember God as He has taught you what you did not know. It says, but if you are fearful, فَإِنْ خِفْتُمْ, fearful of what? Fearful of being unable to guard the laws and the balanced laws of relationships as mentioned in the previous verse. Then the solution is rijalan or rukbanan. Rijalan comes from the root rajala, which signifies movement. Rajala means a leg or a foot, whereas rukbanan means to assemble upon something. And this is why rakaba is often understood to be riding upon something, because you're assembling upon it. So this is the solution. It says if you are fearful of being unable to guard the laws and the balanced laws of relationships, then movements or assembly. But what does this really mean, movements or assembly? Basically, this gives us a two-prong approach or solution. The first solution is that movements or assembly signify a form of travel. We travel on foot, rijalan, which signifies a close location, or we travel riding, rukbanan, which signifies a far location. So God tells us that if for whatever reason we're unable to guard these laws, because it is important to do so, then we need to travel either on foot, close location, or assembly, far location, until we reach a place of security. It says, when you become secure, then remember God as He has taught you what you did not know. Why is He saying that? Why is He saying, remember God as He has taught you what you did not know? Because we were not applying the laws at that location. Now we are to move. And also keep in mind, I invite everybody to read Surah 2, verse 218, which is within the context of this verse. It talks about immigrating in the cause of God, not just for war, but for really anything. If for some reason we are unable to uphold God's laws, then we have every right to move to a different location so that we can practice the Quranic laws freely. So again, movements or assembly signify a two-pronged approach. One of them is to travel. Now the other one, and I mentioned this in another video several years ago, the other solution is to temporarily modify the laws within the Quranic confinements. And I'll get to this and I'll elaborate upon this in the next slide. But basically, rijalan, movements, signifies to adjust. That's why it's using the word rijalan, because it's movements. Adjusting the Quranic laws within the Quranic confinements. And then the other solution, assembly, rukbanan, is to assimilate rukbanan, new laws, but that are still within the Quranic confinements. So again, rijalan or rukbanan has a two-pronged approach: to travel or to temporarily modify the Quranic laws, as long as we stay within the balanced laws that are mentioned in verse 238. So I would like to demonstrate for you how the phrase rijalan or rukbanan, movements or assembly, has a two-solution approach when it comes to a situation where a person is unable to guard the laws and the balanced laws of relationships. Again, this verse is within the context of divorce, marriage, remarriage, and all these things. So let's take, for example, verse 237. It says, if you divorce them before having sex with them, but you have set the dowry for them, then you must give half of what you have agreed, unless they forgive or the guardian over the marriage contract forgives. And if you forgive, it is closer to righteousness. And do not forget the favor between you. God is seer of what you do. So in this particular situation, a couple want to divorce, but they did not have sex. But he has set the dowry for her. Then in this situation, he needs to give half of that dowry unless she forgives that half. So let's say the couple encounters a situation where, for example, this verse it cannot be applied at all. Let's say the country or the culture or their family do not want to apply this particular circumstance or of this verse. Then the first solution is option one, which is to simply travel. Go on foot to a rijalan, a close location, or even riding rukbanan, distant location, until you can apply this particular verse. Okay, that's the first solution. Now, another solution, let's say, for example, this person cannot pay half. He can pay a quarter, and she's okay with that. Then option two applies, because option two, it's to adjust rijalan. He wants to pay a quarter, not a half, and she's okay with that. Then they are working within the confinements of the Quranic laws. They have adjusted based within the Quranic confinements, and she's okay with that. Then perfect, rijalan. Or assimilate rukbanan. Let's say he can't pay half at all. Okay, what does he do in this situation? And she wants something. She's not willing to forgive. She might ask for something else, and he might be okay with that. Then they have rukbanan. They have assimilated a new law, again, within the Quranic confinements. Again, when it comes to marriage and divorce and all these things, it's not always black and white. So God is telling us to move or assimilate within these Quranic laws until you come to a balance. Okay, the idea is to maintain the balanced laws as mentioned in the previous verse. So this is the idea of rijalan or rukbanan. They have a two-prong approach to either travel or to adjust or assimilate to the Quranic laws. And this is how I understand rijalan or rukbanan. So to conclude, God says, guard onto the adherences and the adherence that is balanced, and stand for God in obedience. And if you are in fear, then movements or assembly. And when you are secured, then remember God, just as he has taught you what you did not know. So once again, this verse has nothing to do with ritual salahs, but rather we need to take the context into consideration and understand that this verse is all about ensuring that we are adhering to God's laws about relationships, and he provides for us a solution in the situation in which we are in fear of being unable to guard these adherences.